Don't sign that. The voice was soft, almost lost beneath the low hum of conversations and the quiet clink of silverware, but it cut through the moment with a precision that made Daniel Carter's pen hover just an inch above the paper. 5 minutes earlier, he had been laughing. Not loudly, not carelessly, but with the controlled, dismissive amusement of a man who had built a $3.2 billion empire by trusting only his own judgment. Stick to serving coffee, he had said without looking up, his eyes fixed on the contract spread across the white tablecloth. The restaurant around them glowed in warm amber light, Manhattan's skyline stretching beyond the glass like a promise he had already claimed. Deals like this didn't go wrong. Not for him. Not anymore. Across from him, 2 executives in tailored suits waited with patient smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. The kind of smiles that expected compliance. The kind that assumed the outcome was already decided. Daniel thrived in rooms like this. Controlled environments. Predictable outcomes. Numbers that behaved exactly the way he told them to. And yet, something about the stillness behind him now felt different. Emily Brooks stood just slightly to his right, a simple black apron tied neatly at her waist, a small order pad resting against her palm. She hadn't moved since she spoke, hadn't apologized, hadn't corrected herself. Most people would have. Most people, after interrupting a $200 million deal, would have rushed to explain or retreat. But she didn't. Daniel exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of irritation brushing his expression. He set the pen down deliberately, turning just enough to glance at her. You said something? His tone was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, sharp, controlled. Emily met his gaze, not challenging, not submissive, just steady. The clause on page 12, she said quietly. It doesn't say what you think it says. One of the executives across the table let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if to dismiss the moment entirely. Mr. Carter, he said smoothly, perhaps we should continue. We're on a tight schedule. Daniel's attention flickered back to the contract. Page 12. He had already reviewed it. Twice. His legal team had reviewed it. 3 times. There was nothing there. Nothing unusual. Nothing worth pausing over. And yet, his fingers didn't reach for the pen. Not immediately. Instead, almost against his own instinct, he flipped the page. The paper made a quiet, crisp sound in the silence that followed. Emily didn't move. Didn't speak again. The room seemed to tighten, the air subtly shifting as Daniel's eyes scanned the lines he had already read before. The numbers were the same. The wording was the same. Clean. Professional. Harmless. That's what it looked like. That's what it was supposed to look like. Daniel leaned back slightly, his jaw tightening, just a fraction. It's standard, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Emily's voice came again, softer this time, but somehow heavier. Not the last sentence. His eyes dropped. Just one line, buried at the end of the clause. Easy to skim, easier to miss. And suddenly, for the first time that evening, Daniel Carter didn't laugh. Daniel did not blink, but something behind his eyes shifted as he read the final sentence again, slower this time. Each word separating itself from the others as if it had been waiting to be noticed all along. The clause was clean on the surface, structured like any standard acquisition protection, but the wording at the end twisted the entire meaning. Not ownership transfer, not immediately, but control. Operational control under specific performance triggers that were defined just loosely. Enough to be activated without warning. His fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the paper as the room remained quiet. The 2 executives across from him exchanged a glance so brief it could have been missed, but Daniel did not miss things like that. Not anymore. Not after years of building an empire by catching details others ignored. And yet this had almost slipped through. Almost. Is there a problem? One of them asked, his tone still polite, still smooth, but now carrying something tighter underneath. Daniel did not answer right away, his gaze still fixed on the contract, his mind already running through scenarios, projections, consequences. If signed, the deal would not just bring in projected revenue. It would open a door that someone else would quietly hold the key to, and once opened, it would not close easily. He leaned back slightly, the leather chair barely making a sound. Explain this trigger condition, he said, tapping the line with the tip of his finger, his voice calm again, but colder now, sharper. The smile across the table did not disappear, but it changed, just slightly. It is a standard safeguard. The executive replied. Purely procedural. Daniel's eyes lifted, locking onto his. Standard does not usually include a pathway to override executive authority, he said. And for the first time, the rhythm of the meeting broke. Just a fraction. Just enough. The second executive shifted in his seat, adjusting his cuff as if the room had suddenly grown warmer. You are overanalyzing, he added quickly, but the words landed weaker than intended. Daniel said nothing. He did not need to. Silence, when used correctly, was more powerful than any argument. Behind him, Emily stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable, as if she had simply pointed at something obvious and stepped back, not expecting recognition, not demanding it, just stating a fact. Daniel closed the contract slowly, aligning the edges with deliberate precision before setting it down on the table. We will need to revise this section, he said, his tone final, not aggressive, not emotional, just decisive. The kind of tone that ended discussions, the kind that people like him had spent years learning how to use. The executives hesitated, just for a second, before one of them forced a thin smile. Of course, if that is your preference. But the ease was gone now. The control had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it, even if no one said it out loud. Daniel reached for his glass of water, taking a slow sip, his eyes briefly drifting to the reflection in the window beside them. The city still stretched out beyond, unchanged, unaware of how close he had come to signing something that would have quietly rewritten everything he had built. He set the glass down gently, then turned his head just slightly, enough to look at Emily again. Really look this time, not as background, not as staff, but as someone who had just seen what his entire legal team had not. Why did you notice it? He asked, his voice lower now, not testing, not mocking, just asking. Emily held his gaze for a moment, then glanced at the contract. Because it does not match the rest of the document, she said simply. Everything else protects both sides. That line only protects one. She paused, just a fraction, then added. And it is hidden where most people stop reading. Daniel studied her. The quiet confidence, the absence of hesitation. There was no performance in her words, no attempt to impress, just clarity. And that made it more unsettling than any display of intelligence. The room behind him remained still, waiting, watching, but for the first time that evening, Daniel Carter was no longer the only one in control of what happened next. Daniel did not respond immediately, not because he lacked an answer, but because something far more unfamiliar had taken hold of him. Uncertainty, not the kind that came from risk, but the kind that came from realizing he had almost made a mistake he could not easily undo. The executives across from him were speaking again, offering revisions, alternatives, softer language. But their voices had lost their earlier confidence. Each sentence now carefully measured, each word chosen with caution. Daniel let them talk, his attention no longer on persuasion but on pattern, tone, timing. He had built his reputation on reading people as much as numbers, and now the room felt different, not balanced, not equal, but tilted, slightly, unmistakably. We can have our legal team adjust the wording tonight, one of them said, leaning forward with a practiced smile. There is no need to delay the signing. Daniel finally looked up, his expression calm, but firm. There will be no signing tonight, he said, and that was it. No raised voice, no explanation, just a decision, the kind that closed doors without slamming them. Silence followed, heavier this time, the kind that lingered longer than anyone expected. One of the executives nodded slowly, masking disappointment behind professionalism. Of course, Mr. Carter, we respect your process, but the shift was complete now. Whatever advantage they believed they had walking into this meeting was gone, replaced by something else, caution, calculation. Daniel gathered the contract, sliding it neatly into the leather folder beside him, his movements precise, controlled, but his mind was already somewhere else, replaying a single moment, a single sentence, not the contract, not the executives, but her voice, quiet, steady, certain. It does not say what you think it says. He stood, adjusting his jacket, the conversation effectively over. Hands were shaken, polite words exchanged, but none of it carried weight anymore, not after what had just happened. Within minutes, the table cleared, the executives leaving with carefully neutral expressions. their footsteps fading into the soft background noise of the restaurant. Daniel remained for a moment longer, standing beside the table, the city lights reflecting faintly across the glass. Then he turned, fully this time, toward Emily. She had already resumed her work, as if nothing unusual had occurred, refilling a water glass at a nearby table, her movements efficient, unhurried, invisible again, or at least that was how she appeared to everyone else. Daniel walked toward her, not quickly, not slowly, just deliberately, stopping at the edge of her section. She noticed him. Of course she did. But she did not react until she finished what she was doing, placing the pitcher down, offering a brief polite nod to the guests before stepping aside. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, her tone exactly the same as before, professional, neutral, as if she had not just altered the outcome of a $200 million decision. Daniel studied her for a moment, not trying to intimidate, not trying to impress, just trying to understand. "You saved me from making a very expensive mistake," he said, the words simple, but carrying more weight than any compliment he had given in years. Emily did not smile, did not react the way most people would when acknowledged by someone like him. Instead, she glanced briefly at the table he had just left, then back at him. "You stopped yourself," she said quietly. "I just pointed at something you had not seen yet." Daniel exhaled, a subtle shift in his posture, something less rigid, less guarded. "Most people would not have said anything," he replied. Emily picked up her order pad again, her fingers resting lightly against it. "Most people are not responsible for what happens after," she said, then paused, just for a second, before adding, "But I am, if I notice it and say nothing." Daniel looked at her, really looked this time, not at the uniform, not at the role, but at the person standing in front of him, calm, grounded, certain in a way that did not need validation. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel Carter realized something that no contract, no deal, no boardroom had ever forced him to confront. He had been surrounded by experts for years, but he had not been listening. Not really, and the most valuable insight he had received that night had not come from across the table, but from someone he had almost ignored completely. Daniel did not leave immediately. Even after the conversation had ended and the table behind him had been cleared, he remained standing there for a few seconds longer than necessary, watching Emily as she moved through the restaurant with the same quiet efficiency, carrying plates, refilling glasses, acknowledging guests with a nod that was polite but never exaggerated. There was no trace of what had just happened in her expression, no pride, no hesitation, no expectation, just routine, as if catching a $200 million oversight was no different from noticing an empty water glass, and that unsettled him more than the mistake itself. He had spent years in rooms where people competed to be heard, to prove their value, to be seen by someone like him. But she had done the opposite. She had spoken once, clearly, then stepped back without waiting for recognition. Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek business card, turning it between his fingers for a moment as if weighing something invisible. Then he walked back toward her section, this time stopping closer, close enough that she did not need to look up to know he was there. She finished placing a plate in front of a guest, offered a brief smile, then turned toward him. "Yes, sir." Her tone unchanged, steady, neutral. Daniel held out the card, not forcefully, not casually, just directly. "I want you to call me," he said, the word simple, but deliberate. Emily glanced at the card, then back at him, her eyes calm, unreadable. She did not take it immediately, which in itself was unusual. Most people would have, without hesitation, especially from someone in his position. "Why?" she asked, not challenging, not suspicious, just asking. Daniel paused, just a fraction, as if the answer required more precision than he expected. "Because you see things most people miss," he said finally, "and I need people like that." Emily looked at the card again, then gently placed her order pad against her palm, her fingers still not reaching for it. "You already have people like that," she replied, her voice quiet, but certain. Daniel gave a slight shake of his head. "No," he said. "I have people who agree with me." The distinction hung in the air between them, subtle, but undeniable. Emily studied him for a moment longer, as if measuring something that had nothing to do with money, position, or authority. Then she reached out and took the card, not quickly, not slowly, just deliberately. She glanced at the name, then slipped it into the small pocket of her apron without comment. Daniel watched her, expecting something more, a question, a reaction, anything. But she simply nodded once. "I will think about it," she said, and turned slightly as another table signaled for her attention. The conversation over, just like that. Daniel stood there for a moment, the noise of the restaurant returning around him, glasses clinking, low conversations blending into a familiar rhythm. But something had shifted, not in the room, not in the deal, but in him. He adjusted his cuff, a small, habitual movement, then stepped away, walking toward the exit, each step measured, controlled. But his mind was no longer on the contract, no longer on the executives who had just left. Instead, it circled back to a single realization, clear and unsettling. The most valuable perspective he had encountered that night had come from someone who did not need his approval. And as the door opened and the cool night air met him outside, Daniel Carter understood something he had never fully accepted before. The real risk was not in making the wrong decision. It was in believing you were the only one capable of making the right one. The night air outside was colder than Daniel expected, sharp enough to cut through the rhythm of his thoughts as the city moved around him in its usual relentless pace. Taxis passing, distant sirens echoing between buildings, people walking with purpose, unaware that somewhere above them, a decision had just shifted the course of millions of dollars. But Daniel did not move toward his car right away. Instead, he stood on the sidewalk, one hand in his pocket, the other adjusting the cuff of his sleeve again, a habit that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with control. Except tonight, control felt different, less certain, less absolute. He replayed the moment in his mind, not the contract, not the executives, but her voice, quiet, precise, unshaken. She had not tried to impress him, had not tried to prove anything. She had simply spoken because it was correct, and then she had stepped back, as if the outcome did not belong to her. Daniel exhaled slowly, then finally moved, sliding into the back seat of the car waiting at the curb, the door closing with a soft, insulated thud that shut out the noise of the street. "Home, sir?" the driver asked, glancing briefly through the rearview mirror. Daniel paused, just for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said, his voice calm, but distant. "Office." The car pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic with practiced ease, the city lights streaking past the window as Daniel leaned back into the seat, his eyes unfocused, not tired, not distracted, but processing, recalibrating, something he had not done in a long time. Not like this. His phone buzzed in his hand, a message from his legal team asking if the deal had been finalized. His thumb hovered over the screen for a second before he typed a short response. "Hold all approvals. Full review required." He sent it, then locked the phone, setting it aside, his gaze shifting back to the window. The reflection staring back at him looked the same as always, composed, controlled, successful, but something beneath that surface had shifted, subtly, but undeniably. For years, he had trusted systems, processes, teams, layers of verification designed to eliminate risk, and yet, tonight, none of those had caught what one quiet observation had revealed in seconds. The realization did not threaten him, it unsettled him, not because it exposed weakness, but because it challenged certainty. The car slowed at a red light, the glow reflecting across the interior, casting a brief stillness over everything. Daniel's hand moved slightly, almost unconsciously, toward his jacket pocket, then stopped. The card was no longer there. He had given it away, a small gesture, insignificant by most standards, but not to him, not tonight. He leaned forward slightly, his voice breaking the quiet. "Tomorrow morning," he said. The driver glanced back again, attentive. "Yes, sir?" Daniel's eyes remained on the road ahead. "Clear my first 2 meetings," he continued. "I need time to review something personally." The driver nodded. "Of course." The light turned green, the car moving forward again, and Daniel leaned back once more, closing his eyes for just a second, not in fatigue, but in focus. And in that brief moment of stillness, one thought settled with unusual clarity. The deal he had almost signed would have cost him $200 million, but the real cost would have been something far greater, the illusion that he could not be wrong. And somewhere behind him, in a restaurant that would continue its quiet rhythm long after he left. Emily Brooks returned to her work, unnoticed again, exactly where she had always been, except now, without realizing it, she had changed the way one of the most powerful men in the city would make decisions from this moment forward. Morning came without ceremony. The city already awake before the sun fully settled between the buildings, and inside a glass-walled office 30 floors above the street, Daniel Carter stood alone, looking down at a world that moved exactly as it had the day before, except he did not. His jacket rested neatly on the back of his chair, sleeves rolled just slightly, a rare detail for a man known for precision in every appearance. The contract lay open across his desk, page 12 flattened. Beneath his hand, the same lines circled in clean, deliberate ink. He had not slept much, not because of stress, but because his mind had refused to settle, replaying, analyzing, recalibrating, the kind of mental work that had built his success. But this time, it felt different, less about control, more about understanding. His phone buzzed again, another message from his legal team, detailed analysis, confirmations. They had found it too. Now that they were looking for it, the clause, the trigger, the quiet transfer of control hidden in plain sight. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. It had always been there. They had just not seen it. And that realization stayed with him longer than the numbers attached to it. There was a knock at the door, sharp, efficient. "Come in," he said, his voice steady. His assistant stepped inside, tablet in hand, already prepared. "Your 9 o'clock meeting has been rescheduled, and your legal team is ready for a full briefing," she said. Daniel nodded once, but did not move toward the conference room. "Not yet. Push the briefing back 30 minutes, he said. She hesitated, just slightly. "Is everything all right?" Daniel turned from the window, his expression composed, but his eyes sharper than usual. "I want to review something first," he replied. She nodded, adjusting her schedule without question, and stepped back out. The door closing quietly behind her, the office fell silent again, the kind of silence that did not distract, but clarified. Daniel walked back to his desk, his hand resting lightly against the surface as he looked at the contract one more time. Then he closed it, not abruptly, not carelessly, but with finality. The decision was already made. The deal would not proceed as written, and that was not the part that stayed with him. What stayed was the gap, the distance between what had been presented and what had been true, and how easily that gap could have gone unnoticed. His hand moved toward his phone again, this time not to check messages, but to search. His thumb hovered for a brief second, then typed a single name, Emily Brooks. The screen filled with nothing useful, no profile, no record that matched the clarity he had seen the night before, just fragments, common names, unrelated results. He stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone down slowly, leaning back. In his chair, a faint exhale leaving him, not frustration, not disappointment, just recognition. She was not part of his system, not part of any network he controlled, and that was exactly why she had seen what others had not. His gaze shifted toward the city again, sunlight now reflecting off glass and steel, turning everything bright, sharp, undeniable, and in that reflection, one thought settled with quiet certainty. If insight only came from the same rooms, the same voices, the same patterns, then it was not insight at all. It was repetition. Daniel straightened slightly, reaching for his jacket, his movements returning to their usual precision, but not entirely unchanged. There was something else now, something less rigid, less absolute. And as he stepped toward the door, ready to walk into a room full of experts who had missed what mattered, Daniel Carter carried with him a decision that had nothing to do with contracts, numbers, or authority. He would start listening differently, because the most valuable voice he had heard in years had come from someone no one else thought to listen to. The conference room was already filled when Daniel stepped in, a long glass table surrounded by people who had spent years earning their place in that room. Analysts, attorneys, senior advisors, each one holding reports, tablets, projections, all prepared to explain what had gone wrong and how they would prevent it from happening again. The air carried a quiet tension, not panic, but something closer to discomfort, because everyone in that room understood one thing clearly. Something had been missed, and not just a small oversight, something significant enough to cost $200 million. Daniel walked to the head of the table without rushing, his posture composed, his expression unreadable. He did not sit immediately. Instead, his hand rested lightly against the back of the chair as his eyes moved across the room, meeting each of theirs for just a second longer than usual. "Walk me through it," he said, his voice calm, but direct. One of the senior attorneys cleared his throat, standing slightly as he began. The clause was embedded within a standard control framework, structured in a way that Daniel raised his hand, not abruptly, but enough to stop the explanation. "I know what it was," he said. "I want to know why it was not seen." The room fell quiet, the shift immediate. No one spoke for a moment, the kind of silence that carried weight, not confusion, but accountability. The attorney lowered himself back into his chair, his confidence recalibrating. "It was subtle," he said finally. The language did not raise immediate concern during initial review. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the answer, but not accepting it. "Subtle does not mean invisible," he replied, his tone still even, but sharper. Now, the words settling into the room with precision. One of the analysts leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "We focused on the primary structure of the deal," he said. "The financial projections, the ownership percentages, the risk distribution, everything aligned with expectations." Daniel's gaze shifted to him, steady, unblinking. "And that was the problem," he said. The analyst paused, uncertain. Daniel continued. "You looked for confirmation, not contradiction." He let that sit for a moment, not as criticism, but as fact, something observable, something undeniable. No one argued, because no one could. The pattern was familiar, comfortable, efficient, and flawed. Daniel finally took his seat, his hands resting lightly on the table, not clenched, not rigid, just still. "From now on," he said, "I do not want reviews that tell me why something works." He looked around the room again. Slower this time, more deliberate. "I want reviews that tell me where it breaks." The shift was subtle, but significant, not a change in process, but in perspective. One of the attorneys nodded, writing something down. Another adjusted his tablet, already rethinking his approach. Daniel leaned back slightly, the tension in the room easing just a fraction, but not disappearing, because something else had taken its place. Awareness, the kind that did not fade easily. His phone vibrated softly against the table, a notification he did not check. His attention remained in the room, but part of his mind drifted elsewhere, to a quiet voice, a single sentence, a detail that had been missed by all of them. And for a brief moment, Daniel considered saying it out loud, telling them where the insight had come from. But he did not. Not yet. Instead, he closed the folder in front of him, the sound soft, final. "Run the analysis again," he said, standing up. "Assume nothing is safe just because it looks familiar." The team nodded, some immediately, others after a brief pause. But all of them understood, this was not just a correction, it was a shift in how they would think. Daniel walked toward the door, his movements controlled, but his thoughts still echoing with something simple, something clear. The most important detail in that entire contract had not been found in this room. And that meant something had to change, not just in them, but in him. By the time the sun began to lower behind the skyline, Daniel found himself back where the shift had started, not in the boardroom, not in his office, but standing once again outside the same restaurant, the glass doors reflecting the fading light and his own still figure. He had not planned to return this soon, not consciously, but some decisions did not come from planning. They came from recognition, and something about the unfinished conversation from the night before had stayed with him. Longer than any contract, he stepped inside, the familiar warmth of the room meeting him instantly, the low murmur of voices, the quiet rhythm of service. Nothing had changed, and yet, for him, everything had. He paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room not as a customer, but as someone searching, not for attention, but for clarity. Emily was there, of course she was, moving between tables with the same calm precision, her presence easy to overlook if you were not looking for it, but impossible to ignore once you were. Daniel walked toward her section, not with urgency, but with intent. She noticed him before he reached her, not by turning her head, but by the subtle shift in her posture, awareness without reaction. She finished placing a check on a table, thanked the guests, then turned toward him. "Good evening," she said, her tone the same as before, steady, professional. As if the previous night had been just another shift, Daniel nodded. Once, acknowledging the familiarity of her composure. I came back, he said, not as an explanation, just as a fact. Emily held his gaze for a brief moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I see that, she replied. There was no curiosity in her voice, no assumption, just observation. Daniel glanced around briefly, the room unchanged, the same quiet flow of conversations, then back at her. I reviewed the deal again this morning, he said. You were right. Emily did not react the way most people would. There was no visible satisfaction, no shift in her expression. She simply listened, the way she had the night before. Daniel continued. My entire team missed it. He added, the words carrying more weight than they sounded. Emily tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the statement. That happens, she said, her voice calm, not dismissive, not surprised. Daniel let out a small breath, something between a quiet laugh and a realization. It should not, he replied. Emily's eyes softened just slightly, not with emotion, but with understanding. It does when people stop questioning what looks correct, she said, and the simplicity of the statement settled between them, heavier than any analysis he had heard that day. Daniel studied her again, not for answers this time, but for context. Where did you learn to see things like that? He asked, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question. Emily paused for a moment, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of a nearby table. By being wrong before, she said quietly, and deciding not to be wrong the same way twice. Daniel nodded slowly, the answer not what he expected, but exactly what made sense. There was no story offered, no explanation beyond that, just a principle, simple, earned, real. A nearby table signaled for her attention, and Emily glanced in that direction, then back at him. Is there anything else you need? She asked, the question returning them to the present, to roles, to structure. Daniel looked at her for a moment longer, then shook his head slightly. No, he said. Then after a brief pause, added, not tonight. Emily nodded once, then turned and walked toward the waiting table, her steps unhurried, her focus already shifted, and Daniel stood there for a second longer, watching as she disappeared into the rhythm of the room again, unnoticed by everyone else, but no longer invisible to him. And as he turned to leave, one thought remained, clear and steady. The difference between knowing and understanding was not experience, not position, not authority. It was the willingness to question what everyone else accepted without looking twice. The city had settled into night again, the kind of quiet that never truly became silence, just a softer version of motion. And as Daniel stepped back onto the sidewalk, the glass door closing behind him, he did not check his phone, did not call his driver immediately. He stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and yet seeing more clearly than he had in a long time. The past 24 hours had not changed his position, had not altered his influence, had not reduced the scale of his decisions, but it had shifted something far more subtle. The way he approached them, he reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the absence of the card he had already given away, a small reminder that not everything valuable could be tracked, filed, or controlled. A car pulled up quietly at the curb, right on time, the driver stepping out to open the door, but Daniel did not move immediately, his gaze drifting back toward the restaurant window, where inside, nothing had changed. Tables filled, glasses raised, conversations continued, and somewhere within that rhythm, Emily moved through the space with the same steady presence, unnoticed by most, exactly as she had been before, except now, there was a difference that only he carried. Daniel stepped into the car, the door closing with a soft sound that separated him from the scene behind him, but not from the thought it had left. Office? The driver asked. Daniel paused, then shook his head slightly. No, he said, his voice calm, grounded. Home. The car pulled away, merging into the flow of traffic as the city lights reflected across the window. And for once, Daniel did not look at the skyline as something to measure or conquer, but simply as something to observe. His phone remained still beside him. No urgent messages, no immediate decisions, just space, something he rarely allowed himself. His mind replayed the moment again, Not the mistake, not the numbers, but the stillness, the way one quiet sentence had interrupted certainty, not with force, but with clarity, and how easily he had almost ignored it, how easily it could have been dismissed. He leaned back slightly, the tension in his posture gone, replaced by something quieter, more deliberate, the kind of awareness that did not announce itself, but stayed, the kind that changed how you moved without needing to be seen. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, but inside the car, there was a different kind of silence, one that did not demand answers, only understanding. And as the lights blurred past, Daniel Carter understood something that would not appear in any report, any contract, or any meeting summary, something that would not be written down, but would shape every decision that followed. The most dangerous assumption was not that others knew less. It was that you had already seen everything worth seeing, and sometimes the difference between losing everything and keeping it came down to whether you listened when no one expected you to. And somewhere behind him, in a restaurant that would never know what it had quietly witnessed, a waitress continued her shift, unnoticed, unchanged, and entirely certain in something no title could ever give her. She did not raise her voice. She raised the standard.